I won't mention the name, but there was a particular U.S. trade representative who told me a few years ago, said, I can't understand those Japanese. Well, I don't see how you can be effective in negotiating if you don't understand where the other party is coming from, because half of a negotiation is understanding where the other party is coming from. I really think that there's really a real dearth of area expertise about Asia in senior positions in the U.S. government, and that is something that I think needs to be rectified.
So I want to welcome you all. We have an in-person audience and an online audience. I heard of Glen Fukushima decades ago when all my professor wouldn't stop talking about this really smart guy who understood U.S.-Japan relations, and we all needed to listen to him. So I am just so thrilled that I'm getting that chance this week. I'm thrilled that we're all getting that chance this week. This program and this week has been a fantastic collaboration. I'm going to say a joyous collaboration. We have a Mahalo page that comes up on the screen. It's also in your brochure. I want to give a couple quick shout-outs, though, to the UH Office of the President, including President Wendy Hensel and her staff, Amy Luke and Courtney Domingo, and the UH Office of Communications in UH News. The Better Tomorrow Speaker Series has brought a level of professionalism and knowledge and understanding to today's event that we could not have matched or even come close to. So I want to thank Robert Perkinson and the team that he works with in that. The UH College of Social Sciences stepped up, and you are all invited to a reception with light refreshments after today's event, and that is thanks to the UH College of Social Sciences, Dean Denise Konan, Nori Tarui, who works with the Dean, and they derive their support from the Japan America Institute of Management Sciences Endowment to promote global leaders for sustainable futures and Fujitsu Limited. And then I want to shout out to the VIPs in the audience today, which is our students. So those of you who are students here at UH Manoa or in our university and have come today, we're thrilled that you're getting this opportunity. You are the next generation. You are the people we're counting on for the future. And so you are the most important people here today, besides our guest. I'm gonna, or thereabouts. I'm gonna introduce Dean Denise Konan of the UH Manoa College of Social Science, who will introduce our honored guest, and Shannon Dorsey of the East-West Center, who I should also shout out to there in telling you who will be sharing their thoughts with you today. So mahalo to you all for being here. Mahalo to our folk on the stage. Mahalo to Dean Konan.
Aloha. Aloha, everyone. Well, it's very exciting to be here, and I'm looking out at the audience and just overjoyed to see a strong representation from our local community who is here in the room, as well as our faculty and researchers, and also students. It's just a wonderful mix here. But as Marcus said, we also have, I think it's over 175 who are watching by Zoom. It's quite a number on Zoom as well. So that reflects this high level of interest in the topic here today. And before I do my introductions, Mark Levin gave the great thanks for Center of Japanese Studies, East-West Center, the Better Tomorrow series, and I just also wanted to thank Mr. Takeshi Korii, who's here today from James Endowment, who is helping to sponsor this event today. So please give a hand to all the sponsors. Okay, so you are here today because of the, in part because of the sensitivity of this day and this time. And also the just amazing gravitas of our featured speaker, Glen Fukushima, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. He's the vice chair of Securities Investor Protection Corporation. He's also former president of the American Chamber of Commerce of Japan. He's former deputy assistant to the USTR, U.S. Trade Representatives for Japan and China. And if you're not aware what that means, during some of the very sensitive times of negotiating our trade relationships between Japan and the U.S., in the most sensitive times, in the 1980s, maybe some of you will remember that time, he was directly involved in helping to not only deal with the U.S. response, but opening up Japan markets to U.S. exports and so forth. So he's had very long relations. But I also want to say this morning, several deans and I had the opportunity to sit down with Glen, and I was personally touched that he is also very committed to U.S. and Japan relations through academic programs, through universities. And in fact, he is the first philanthropist to contribute to the Japan Fulbright program, which is generous indeed. And that's in recognition, I think, of what students and international exchange can do to foster our global relations. To me, that's very impressive. So we are very, very excited to hear from him today, especially on the topic of our presentation. I also want to give a acknowledgement to our outstanding moderator, Shannon Dorsey, who is with the East-West Center as our U.S. State Department's diplomatic fellow. She has an outstanding record in service to the United States as a diplomat, and she was most recently the Cultural Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Japan, and she's been a congressional fellow with the American Political Science Association, amongst other kinds of services. So with that, let's all give them a warm welcome, and we'll get on with our program.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much. First, let me thank Mark Levin and Tim George and Joan Pan for their efforts, and the Center for Japanese Studies here at the University of Hawaii for arranging for me to visit. It's great to be back in Hawaii. I arrived on Sunday from Washington, D.C., and in my first couple of days, I was asked by several people here, is this your first trip to Hawaii? So I actually sat down last night and tried to think how many times I've been to Hawaii, and altogether I think it's been more than 20. But as I wrote in my outline, which I prepared, which I hope you have, the first time I came to Hawaii was 1956. My father, I'm an Army brat, my father was stationed in Japan with the U.S. Army, and so he brought his family to Fort Ord, California for his assignment in the mainland. And I remember as a 6-year-old, my parents and I boarded a military air transport airplane out of Haneda and went to Wake Island, and then to Hickam Air Force Base here, and then to Travis Air Force Base in Oakland. So that's my first time to Hawaii. And then when I was at USTR, also the U.S. Trade Representative from 85 to 90, I came to Hawaii at least 5 or 6 times for U.S.-Japan trade negotiations, especially on issues like semiconductors, supercomputers. And these were in Honolulu, also Kauai, Maui, the Big Island. And when I was with Airbus, the Airbus company had several customer events on the Big Island. And then when my wife was selected to be the first woman board member of Sony, Howard Stringer, the then CEO, invited us several times to the Sony Open. So I came and enjoyed that. The last time I was here was 2017. I'm on the board of the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, and a group of us, about 20 of us, came for the first Honolulu Biennale at that time. So we went to the art events here, and then we went to Maui for one day. So it's great to be back, and I really want to thank Mark and the center for inviting me. So today's topic, the transformation of national security in Asia, is a very hot topic and something that we could spend hours discussing and debating, but given the limited time, I prepared an outline, which I think in about 35 minutes, I hope I can cover. So first, if we think about history and about this relationship between national security in Asia, I think we all remember that this is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. And so the Pacific War, which Hawaii clearly was very intimately involved in on December 7th of 1941. Then the Korean War, and then the war in Vietnam. These are three major conflicts in Asia that the United States has been involved in over the last 80 years. And then with the end of the Cold War, until the end of the Cold War, obviously there was a great deal of attention being given by the United States in Asia to both China and the Soviet Union. Although the Cold War ended pretty much with the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, I think there are three major areas of challenges that the U.S. faces in terms of national security in Asia. One is the North Korea and the missile and nuclear development there. The second is Russia, especially with recent invasion of Ukraine. And thirdly is China and the rise of China, tensions with Taiwan, tensions in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, including Senkaku Islands with regard to Japan. So clearly there are many areas of concern that the United States has in terms of national security in Asia. But I think it's important for us to discuss and to come to some agreement as to what the scope and definition of national security is. I think it's much broader than a lot of people assume. I think many people, when they hear national security, they think about military security, which is kind of the traditional way of thinking about national security. So I've listed here in my outline military security at the top, because obviously conventional warfare, nuclear warfare, biochemical warfare, these are all part of the military dimensions of national security. Also the political dimension, which includes diplomatic competition, which State Department and other diplomats engage in every day, is an important part of national security. And recently, I think I would say in the last 30 to 40 years, economic security is something that's receiving a great deal more attention than in the past. And I'll talk more about this in detail. But clearly this would include trade, investment, finance, and foreign aid. A fourth area is technological national security. If we think about semiconductors, supercomputers, telecommunications, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, these are all part of national security on the technology side. Cultural diplomacy and cultural issues are really an integral part of national security, and I think people involved in public diplomacy in particular are experts on this, and people like Joe and I at the Kennedy School at Harvard have written extensively about soft power and the strengths that the United States has to persuade rather than to coerce others. Health and medical security is clearly an issue of national security, although we don't often think about it. But during the COVID experience, certainly it was very clear that this was an issue of national security. Natural disasters, I think in the United States, especially with climate change and hurricanes, we're experiencing more and more of this, but certainly in places like Japan and Hawaii, earthquakes, tsunami, fires, hurricanes, typhoons, these are all aspects of national security, I would argue. And then finally, resources. I think in the United States, because at least the mainland United States, because it is such a large continental power, and we don't think that much about food security because we have so much agricultural ability to sustain ourselves. But in places like Japan, clearly food security is a very high concern, as is the ability to have clean water, energy, minerals, etc. So I think national security is really quite a broad concept. But today I want to focus especially on the military, economic, political, and technological aspects of national security. With regard to the military aspects of national security, in Asia, the United States has had traditionally several very strong bilateral security arrangements and treaties. Probably the most prominent is the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and the U.S. ROK, South Korea Security Treaty, also is a very formal and very well-established security treaty. There are other more informal arrangements with Australia, the Philippines, and others. But on the bilateral security front, I think the U.S. is well positioned. Recently, for instance, on February 7th, Prime Minister Ishiba of Japan visited Washington, met with President Trump. And in that meeting, if you look at the official statement that was issued, I think there was a lot of preparation being done by the State Department, National Security Council, Department of Defense, and others on the U.S. side and on the Japanese side. But if you look at that statement, it looks pretty traditional. It looks like there's a real sense of continuity with strong bilateral U.S.-Japan security cooperation, and with the U.S. recognizing that the Senkaku Islands fall under the purview of Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and so forth. But I think on the security side, the military security side, between the U.S. and Japan, there are some pending issues that may or may not become serious issues. For instance, Japan has, over the last several years, under Prime Minister Abe, Suga, Kishida, and now Ishiba, have committed to increasing Japan's defense expenditures. And over a 5-year period, Japan is going to be almost doubling its security, national military defense expenditures, so that it will be about 2% of GDP. Until recently, the cap was pretty much 1%. It'll be 2% over a 5-year period, but already there's been voices in the United States. Elbridge Colby, for instance, the person nominated to be the Undersecretary of Defense, in a recent nomination confirmation hearing in Washington, explicitly said he didn't think 2% was sufficient for Japan. It should be at least 3%. And George Glass, the incoming ambassador to Japan from Portland, Oregon, also in a confirmation hearing talked about the need for Japan to greatly increase its defense expenditures. Also, host nation support, the support that Japan provides for U.S. military forces in Japan, about 50,000. That's an issue that President Trump seems to be very interested in. In the first term, there was talk. John Bolton, the National Security Director at the time, mentions in his book about the desire by the then president to have Japan quadruple its contribution to host nation support. So that may or may not come up as an issue over the next 3.5 years, 4 years. Also, with the increase by Japan of its defense expenditures, I think there's a great deal of expectation in the United States that Japan will buy more arms exports from the United States. At the same time, Japan is trying to both increase its own ability to provide for arms, but also diversify its supply to other countries, and notably the cooperation with Italy and the UK in the next generation interceptor is one example. And then there were plans to change the organizational structure and command structure of the U.S. forces in Japan, but that, according to a news account just within a couple of days, that's been put on hold by the administration, primarily apparently based because of cost concerns. But I think this notion of cutting costs, which we've all been reading about with Elon Musk and Doge, that will obviously affect not only domestic but also foreign operations of the United States, and what aspects of the security policy in Asia will be affected by this is still not clear. It's clear that over the last several years, one of the transformations I think we've seen in Asia is that many of the relationships that used to be bilateral between the United States and individual countries have become more quadrilateral or regional, or in some cases more global. The Quad is one example of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India cooperating. AUKUS, with the US, the UK, and Australia cooperating on the next generation nuclear submarines. Also, especially during the Biden administration and Obama administration, less so under the first Trump administration, there was a real attempt to try by the United States to improve relations between Japan and South Korea. And at one point, the relationship a few years ago was in a pretty sad state, but I think thanks to efforts by all three countries, and frankly, thanks to the change of leadership of all three countries, there's been significant improvement in the relationship between Japan and South Korea. And the Biden administration in particular has really tried to enhance and strengthen those ties. Also, in the recent few years, there's been a conscious attempt to try to strengthen relations between the United States, Japan, and the Philippines. And so this is another example of where it's not bilateral, but it's more regional and multilateral. And so some have argued, including Rahm Emanuel, who was the U.S. ambassador to Japan under the Biden administration, that the U.S. has shifted from a hub and spoke approach on military security in Asia to a lattice work of relations with countries. The economic side of the relationship is something that I, especially having been a business person for 22 years and also having been at USTR dealing with economic issues, I've paid a lot of attention to. And one of the really interesting and I think important transformations that we've seen in terms of national security in Asia is that economics is playing a much bigger role than it did 20, 30, or 40 years ago. That's not to deny the importance of the military security side, which continues to be important. But on the economic side, also, we've seen a shift, I think, from bilateral emphasis and relations. For instance, when I was at USTR, we were thinking primarily of US-Japan when we were focusing on trying to open the Japanese market. We were thinking about US-Japan relations. But now, it's very hard to think of relations between the US and Japan economically without thinking about the broader Asia region, including especially China. There have been a proliferation over the last 20 years or so of bilateral FTAs and EPAs, free trade agreements, economic partnership agreements. So that has continued. But in addition, there are many multilateral arrangements. ASEAN being one, APEC another, TPP or CPTPP, RCEP. These multilateral arrangements, I think, are the wave of the future. And so this is something that I personally think it's problematic the U.S. is not as engaged in as it was before. As you know, the U.S. pulled out of TPP in the first Trump administration, and the U.S. is not a part of RCEP. And the U.S. is, I think, playing less of a role in APEC than it used to. So this, I think, is in the long run not a positive thing for the United States. One of the interesting things, when I was at USTR and then subsequently, I came to the realization that it was 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II, and just before the Cold War was developing between the US and the Soviet Union, that the National Security Council was created. And it wasn't until 46 years later, in 1993, that the National Economic Council was created. And during the campaign of 1992, I remember Bill Clinton, candidate Clinton, and others talking about it's the economy is stupid, because that year of 1992, it was seen that the U.S. economy was not doing well, and it's one of the reasons that George H.W. Bush lost that election. It's one of the reasons that Ross Perot was a third-party candidate and got 19% of the popular vote. But During that campaign of 92, Bill Clinton promised that there would be an Economic Security Council, which was later renamed National Economic Council. And I remember going to the Little Rock Economic Summit in December of 1992 and having discussions about this. And the following month, in January of 93, when the Clinton administration came into office, they created a National Economic Council because of the recognition that economic issues needed to have the same level of attention in the White House as military security issues. But I think that the fact that it took 46 years for the United States to have a National Economic Council, to me, indicates that, including in places like the State Department, that the priority was given to military security, which was understandable during the Cold War. But in the recent number of years, and I'll explain a bit later, the importance of economic issues has really increased, and so the recognition of that has caught up. To me, a really pivotal case was the semiconductor negotiations between the US and Japan. Soon after I joined US Chair in April 1985, the SIA, Semiconductor Industry Association, filed a Section 301 petition, and we started 1 year of negotiations with Japan on semiconductors. At that time, in the US government, there were three groups, and these three groups had very different views about this issue. The first group was USTR and Commerce, which were in favor of American producers. We felt that we were trying to defend the interests of American semiconductor manufacturers who had come to the government, to USTR, with their petition, arguing that they were having difficulty getting into the Japanese market. Regardless of what the exchange rate was, it was impossible to get into Japan. And also the argument that Japanese companies were selling their semiconductors in the United States below the cost of production, dumping. So the Commerce Department and USTR negotiated with Japan. And so the producers group was the first group. The second group was the State Department, National Security Council, and DOD. And these people basically were saying, look, we have this very close cooperative security relationship with Japan. If we press Japan too hard on the economic issues, it's really going to damage the security relationship. In fact, there was one person, senior person in the US Embassy in Tokyo, who told me, Glenn, if we push Japan too hard on economic issues, we're going to lose our bases in Okinawa. So I thought that was kind of an overstatement, but that was the concern that some expressed. But the third group, really interesting third group, this was during the Reagan administration. There were people with PhDs from the University of Chicago who had the argument that it was really the consumers in the United States we should be protecting. And therefore, if Japan wanted to produce semiconductors below cost of production or sell them at below cost of production, that's fine because American consumers will benefit. The argument was a chip is a chip. Didn't matter whether it's a semiconductor chip or a potato chip. Why produce semiconductors? We don't need to produce semiconductors. That was the argument that was being made. It was very, very interesting, this kind of ideological, theoretical notions about economic welfare. But so these are the three groups that were arguing with each other within the US government and having a very difficult time on pressing Japan on semiconductors. But what happened was that we reached an agreement in 1986. The US felt that Japan was not adequately implementing the agreement. And so the US ended up, after several months, imposing $300 million worth of tariffs on Japan, which was the first time in the post-war period that the United States had imposed that kind of punitive tariffs on Japan. But the reason that happened was that the State Department, NSC, and DOD came around to the view of the producers' representatives, the USTR and Commerce, because they realized that semiconductors had military implications. And so it was true with semiconductors and also supercomputers that the people involved in national security actually thought, well, this is not only an economic issue, it's a military security issue. And one of the reasons for that is that there was a book published by, or written by, Mr. Shintaro Ishihara, who had been a cabinet member, Minister of Transport, and then became governor of Tokyo. But he published a book called The Japan That Can Say No. And in that book, he says explicitly, he says, Japanese semiconductors are the most advanced semiconductors in the world, and if Japan were to sell these to the Soviet Union rather than to the United States, this could overnight tip the balance of power militarily. And the CIA freaked out, and they actually produced a pirated English translation, which became a bestseller in Washington, D.C. But it was a Sputnik moment when the national security people thought, wow, economic commercial issues can become a security issue. And I think that really, this was 1987, and I think this is what triggered the eventual creation of the National Economic Council in 1993. And I believe that there's a straight line between that and the concern with Japan in the 1980s and the current concern about China and its development of semiconductors, supercomputers, telecommunications, AI, and so forth. And although no matter how much the US-Japan competed economically and technologically at that point, Japan was a military ally of the United States, whereas China clearly is not. And so there are some similarities, but some real differences between Japan and China. But this notion of economic issues and the importance of technology is something that I think is becoming increasingly evident in the United States. And so, Japan in the 1980s and China in the 2010s, there are some parallels. So semiconductors, supercomputers, quantum computing, telecommunications, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and others. So this creates some really interesting issues, I think, especially since 2017, with the concern about China and the perceived need in the United States for an industrial policy to deal with this. I think the focus on industrial policy has basically derived from two things. One is the concern during the COVID period that we can't leave everything to the private sector. The government actually has to play a role. That's number one. But the number two is China. And you have people like Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, who's written and testified before Congress saying, no matter how competitive American companies might be, they're not going to be able to compete with China because China, the government and the companies cooperate. And therefore, there's no way that the US can effectively compete with China. And so this perceived need for industrial policy has, I think, spurred the Biden administration, for instance, to get the Congress to pass the CHIPS Act to try to have billions of dollars for investment by the Commerce Department in Intel and TSMC and other semiconductor companies. But one of the really interesting issues is that in this area of technology, government is not really in control. It's the private sector. It's the private sector that has the technology, the funding, the personnel, the expertise in this area. So, for instance, when I talk to specialists in the National Security Agency, they talk about cybersecurity, and it's very difficult for the U.S. government to keep up with those people who are trying to engage in cyber threats, either commercial or political. And so cybersecurity is an area where clearly the U.S. government is not the one that has all the cards. It's the private sector that has many of the people, the funding, the resources, technology. You think about Starlink, for instance, which Elon Musk has control of, and this is a very important technology for Ukraine to be able to use in its war with Russia. But that's not the part of, you would think traditionally the DoD should be in control, but it's not. It's a private company. SpaceX is another example of a private company that is doing what in the past used to be done by NASA. So, but when you have private companies providing elements of national security, private companies are supposed to provide profits for shareholders. And to what extent that motive and the requirements of national security, to what extent those are consistent is a real question. And so I remember back to 1990, my last year at USTR, Bob Reich, who used to be the Secretary of Labor for Bill Clinton, wrote a very famous article in Harvard Business Review of January, February 1990. The title was, "Who is Us?" And his argument at that time was multinational corporations have become so stateless, so global, that senior executives in the companies, employees of the companies, shareholders of the companies, customers, partners are global. So a company may be headquartered in the United States, but is it really an American company? And so this question of the ownership of companies, as well as the extent to which governments have control over elements of national security, is a real issue. And if you think about the role of the state in the United States and in China, clearly there's a huge difference between the relationship between the companies and the state. And clearly in China, there's a much greater ability of the state, for instance, to require a company to provide information to the government, which is one of the issues over TikTok now, as you know, between the US and China. But so the fact that economic security, technology, these issues have become more of an issue really raises this question about the private sector and the government. So the challenges, I think, that we face in national security, including especially in East Asia, I would say are, number one, in order to effectively have a national security policy, we have to have some consistency of government policy over time. And that's a real challenge for the United States because unlike countries like the Russia or China or North Korea, which don't have two-year cycles like we do of elections, in the U.S., every 4 years we have a presidential election, but every 2 years, we have a midterm election, and depending on the results of the midterm elections, the ability of the administration to do what it wants will be constrained. So having consistency of government policy over time is a real challenge, I think, for the United States. Secondly, having a coherent strategy, because the U.S. is a very diverse country, and even if you have coherence within the administration, having cooperation with the Congress, and then being able to coordinate with the private sector is a real challenge. I think one of the challenges that the Biden administration had was that the Biden administration, I think, in contrast to the Clinton administration, Obama administration, really did not have close ties to the business community. And there were very few people in senior positions in the Biden administration who came from the private sector. And I think it was intentional. I think the administration hired mainly people who had worked in Washington, in the Obama administration and elsewhere, but very, very few people, very much unlike the Clinton and Obama administration. I think that really handicapped the Biden administration, both with regard to creating and implementing policy, but also with regard to electoral results. So coordinating with allies is also another real challenge. And I think certainly the U.S. in these areas of technology cooperation with China has been successful by and large up to now, cooperating with Japan, with South Korea, with Taiwan, but there may be some limits to this. And to what extent the Trump administration decides to contain exports to China and to try to get these other countries, especially Japan and South Korea, to cooperate, we'll see what happens there. But the interests of our allies in the United States are not 100% aligned. And so making sure that we can coordinate with our allies is a challenge. Also, another challenge for the United States is enlisting allies. I think that one of the problems of the Biden administration is that the president basically divided the world into democracy and autocracy. And there's a lot in between. And if you think about the global South, it's really, I think, unproductive for the United States to try to divide the world as it did during the Cold War and say you're either pro-communist or pro-capitalist. The world is much more complex than that. And the global south, including countries like Indonesia, are increasingly important for the U.S. to enlist as allies, and I think that's a real challenge. And again, I think coordinating with the private sector really is a big challenge, and coordinating with the private sector also requires that there be some private sector people in the government who understand how the private sector operates. I'm one of those who believes that it's not good to have too many people from the private sector in the government, because the government can be captured by the private sector, which is not good. At the same time, if you don't have people from the private sector in the government will not understand what the private sector needs and what motivates the private sector. So that is a fine balance, but that is something the U.S. needs to do in order to have an effective national security policy. Also, it's been my experience in Washington, 5 years at USG and then another 13 years at the Center for American Progress, is that there is a real dearth of expertise in Washington about Asia. There are hardly any people at the senior level. By senior level, I'm talking about assistant secretaries above, people who cross that calculation. Very few people who have lived and worked in Asia can read or speak Asian languages. It's really quite remarkable, given the fact that the U.S. generally, but especially in places like Hawaii and the West Coast, there are a lot of people with a lot of experience working in Asia, and language experience, cultural, local knowledge, and so forth. And yet, the government, certainly in my observation, has done very little to tap that expertise. I mean, people like Shannon and others in the State Department, the Foreign Service. These are real experts in the areas that they're going to, that they work in. But I'm talking about the Assistant Secretary above, the political positions. Very, very few people. And so I think that is a real weakness that the United States has, because one of the imperatives in negotiating effectively or having a strategy is to understand the competition. And to understand the competition, I think it's essential that we have people with area expertise. I remember, I won't mention the name, but there was a particular U.S. trade representative who told me a few years ago, said, I can't understand those Japanese. Well, I don't see how you can be effective in negotiating if you don't understand where the other party is coming from, because half of a negotiation is understanding where the other party is coming from. I really think that there's really a real dearth of area expertise about Asia in senior positions in the U.S. government, and that is something that I think needs to be rectified. So in terms of prospects, I think I'm coming down to my last few minutes, so I've written here on my outline that there have been some rather dramatic changes in the security environment in Asia. I haven't had time to point out all of them, but I think especially in the military security and the economic and technology areas, we've seen these changes. And I think we do face very serious competition with China, and serious issues on military security with Russia and the DPRK. My final point I'd like to make refers back to my point about area expertise, but I think that Hawaii, because of the advantages you have here, and I think there are basically, three sets of advantages. One is geographical advantage, being here between the mainland U.S. and Asia, you have the ability to know and understand better what's going on in the region than, say, Washington, D.C., which is so far removed. So there's a geographic advantage that you have. There's also an expertise advantage you have, because you do have institutions like the University of Hawaii and the East-West Center and other places where you gather people from not only the United States, but also from Asia. So you have the ability to discuss and debate and get to understand each other better. So the level of expertise and knowledge about Asia is significantly higher than Hawaii than most parts of the United States. And so that's a real advantage. And then thirdly, I think there is a diversity advantage. When I was returned to Washington, D.C. in 2012, after working in Japan for 22 years, David Miliband, who had been the foreign secretary in the Blair administration, in Britain came to Washington, and we had in Washington a discussion of about 25 people to talk for 2 hours about a progressive foreign policy. And the Center for American Progress convened a workshop seminar inviting people from Brookings, CSIS, from Carnegie, from Heritage, Hudson, a whole range of progressive and conservative think tanks. And it was a very interesting discussion, but I realized at the end of the 2 hours, I was looking around the table, and there were 15 white men and 10 white women. And I was the only person of color in the meeting, number one. But even more surprising was that I was the only person who had any experience or knowledge about Asia. Everybody else was a Euro specialist, or a Middle Eastern specialist, or a Russia specialist, or a Latin America specialist. It was amazing. I mean, this was the end of the first Obama administration, where the president and Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, said we're having an Asia pivot, Asia rebalance. We're going to, given the importance of Asia, shift resources, shift some time and focus and attention to Asia. And yet, this discussion of progressive foreign policy, it really struck me that there's a real dearth of expertise and diversity in Washington when it comes to foreign policy, especially with regard to Asia. And so my request to University of Hawaii and East West Center is to project yourself more to Washington, D.C., and to be able to leverage your advantage so as to inform and educate Washington so that they will have a more effective and successful policy towards Asia. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I was busy, as I'm sure most of the audience was, taking notes as you were speaking. I feel like every time I speak with you, I learn something new. I think just talking a little bit on this last point and talking about the pipeline of talent to become that future U.S., and we'll just take this case as for an example, the U.S.-Japan experts. For the students in the audience who we have here today, what do you have some advice for them? How can they get into this space to really become the experts that are needed?
Well, I think there are two things. One is area expertise, and the other is disciplinary expertise. And I think one of the difficulties right now in the United States, those who are in academics will know this, there are a number of major American universities, Columbia University, Yale University, Princeton University, University of Michigan, University of Chicago, and Stanford, that do not have a tenured professor of Japanese politics. Now, it's really quite amazing, given the fact, number one, that the U.S.-Japan relationship is supposed to be so important. Japan is supposed to be the most important ally of the United States in Asia. Number two, there's a lot of money. There's actually $5 million that the other government put to Columbia, to Georgetown, to Hudson, to MIT, and $8 million to Stanford. So there's a lot of money. There aren't people. And the reason there aren't people is that there are area expertise, there are area experts, but they go to the think tanks. The political science departments in the United States, major research universities, they're all focused on theory and methodology. So they don't value area expertise. So you have people, political scientists, who do electoral comparative analysis of 15 different countries, use a computer to do these regression analyses. And if the theory and the methodology are elegant and, kind of leading edge, that's what gets you tenure. You don't have to know the language, the history, politics, anything. You just know the numbers. You just get the numbers. So there's a huge gap between the area specialist and the disciplinary specialist. And so that's what has to be, the gap has to be filled. So the young people need to go to Japan or go to China or whatever, go and learn the language, the history, the customs, the politics, understand the country, but also have the expertise in terms of discipline, whether it's political science, economics, business, law, whatever. But you have to have both. Yeah. You can't rely on just one.
That's really good advice for all the students out there. I hope you're taking notes. And then broadening out a little bit, just because when we first met, it was in Tokyo and it was at the embassy. So as the embassy is preparing to welcome a new ambassador, Ambassador George Glass, right, what advice do you have for him? I remember this position when we were thinking about welcoming Ambassador Emmanuel. We had a 90-day plan, a 120-day plan, a 650-day plan. And when he got there, it kind of all went out the window because he had his own plan.
Right.
But I know that you probably were listening to the testimony last week
Sure.
when Ambassador-to-be Glass was on the Hill. But what do you recommend for him as he gets started?
Well, I've known all the U.S. ambassadors to Japan since Mike Mansfield. So it's been, shows how old I am, but so there have been 10 so far, and George Glass will be number 11. Actually, it was a teaching fellow for Edwin Reischauer at Harvard after he was ambassador, so if you count Reischauer, there will be 12. So I've seen a lot of these people up close, and I guess the main thing is I would like the U.S. ambassador to Japan to get to know a wide range of Japanese. It's very easy for an ambassador, especially if he or she doesn't speak Japanese, and probably the case. I mean, the last American ambassador to Japan spoke Japanese was Reischauer. So, but it's very easy for them to kind of limit themselves to English-speaking people who are of a certain variety, say LDP, or bureaucrats, or scholars that are friendly to the U.S. So, but I think it's very important for the ambassador to get exposure to a wide range of Japanese, because I think Japan, perhaps in the 1950s and 60s, you could, kind of say that there's a certain small group of leaders that decide everything, so you kind of can deal only with these people. But I think Japan over the last 30 or 40 years has become so diversified, and so that it's really important for the ambassador to understand what's going on in Japan by getting to know and interacting with and exchanging views with a wide range of Japanese, whether it's males, females, it's professions, it's age. I mean, I think there's a bias generally, in part because Japanese society tends to be old male focused, that those old males are the ones who kind of provide the information that Americans get. But obviously, you and others who speak Japanese and who can interact with Japanese of a broader range, that really gives a better understanding of Japan. So I think my major point of advice would be to expose the ambassador to a wide range of Japanese, not just a very limited group.
Oh, that's great. And I'm sure that he will have ample opportunity to do that. I know that the team there is working pretty hard on his welcome. Also, just thinking back to my time in Tokyo, one of the things that struck me that I'm not sure I was really quite prepared for was the number of course, U.S. officials coming out to the region. Of course, they would be interested in stopping in Japan and had their reasons for doing that. I was somewhat surprised by the number of governors and the number of mayors that came out to visit during the 3 years that I was there. And we talked a little bit this morning on the importance, as we would say in the State Department, on subnational diplomacy, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that and some of the opportunities looking at the next few years that subnational diplomacy can offer both countries.
No, I think there's a tremendous potential for cooperation and exchanges between states, municipalities, on the U.S. side as well as the Japanese side. When I went back to Washington in 2012, the then chairman of the board of NHK, a guy named Matsumoto, who had come out of JR, he was visiting Washington to attend a conference, and Ambassador Sasai hosted a lunch, and I was invited to lunch, and I asked him, I said, so how many journalists are from NHK are here in the United States? He said, altogether, 19, including all the technicians and announcers and everything. So I said, so of these, how many of them are outside of the East Coast? He said, one. He said, one in Los Angeles. Everybody else is in Washington and New York. I mean, it's like, I think the notion is all the political decisions are made in Washington, and all the economic decisions are made in New York, and then there's Hollywood. And so, but that's kind of I think traditional old 50-year-old thinking about the United States. But clearly, I mean the power of the states and the influence of the states and the cities. And I mean, when Rahm Emanuel was ambassador, I mean he talk about how important mayors can be in the United States. And I think, especially now, I think because there is a gap between Washington and some of the states and the initiatives like places like California are playing, that I think that the role of local and state leaders and prefectural leaders is very important. And also in Japan, as you probably know, in the last several years, a number of people who used to be in the national legislature, in the Diet, have decided rather to become governors because they feel they have more authority and are able to get things done on the gubernatorial level. And I think there's a kind of a parallel in the United States where governors feel empowered to do a lot of things that the federal government can't necessarily do. So I think there's just a tremendous amount of potential for cooperation, for investment, for learning between sub-national groups.
And I
of
feel
countries.
like on the U.S. side, we get that a little bit. I feel like on the Japanese side, they really get it and have started to make it a point of not only traveling to Washington, D.C., but also going to North Carolina,
Sure.
speaking of Prime Minister Kishida's last visit.
Yep.
But on the U.S. side, getting people to go someplace other than Tokyo, I think is always a struggle.
Yes.
You know, in part because they've got just a short time there. But I think Colcon, to your point this morning, thinking about some of the educational ties between the U.S. and Japan, they've done a very good job about hosting things outside of Tokyo.
Right.
And it would be something that I would definitely advocate for others to think about
Right.
doing as
Well,
well.
when I was vice chair of Colcon, we had a conference in Okinawa because we wanted to
Great, yes.
have a more diverse view of Japan as well.
That's great. Fukuoka was,
Ah.
when I was there, was
Yeah,
where it was held.
right.
So, yeah, that's terrific.
The other thing too is young people. You know, I think the generational issue is very important in terms of getting more young people engaged in Japan and U.S.-Japan relations. Because, I mean, the 50s and 60s, there was this core of Japanese who came to U.S. on the Fulbright program and others, and so. But I've heard also for like John Emerson, who was ambassador to Germany, it's similar in Germany where the older generation is very knowledgeable and very friendly towards the United States. The younger generation is not necessarily that way. And I think it is important for the U.S. to try to reach out to the younger generation.
I do too. I do too. And then before we switch it over to the audience, just one last question, which is an area of weakness for me, admittedly, is on the economic security front. So I really appreciated your examples talking about the semiconductor industry in the late 80s. You know, one of the things that I was hearing as I was preparing to leave Japan was a lot of our leadership, Ambassador Emmanuel, but also our Deputy Chief of Mission, Ray Green, would say, you know, like in the late 80s, early 90s, the relationship had a lot of friction to it in terms of economic issues, things like semiconductors. With the exception perhaps of steel right now, there isn't a lot of that exists in Japan. Do you foresee that maintaining? Do you see the threat of tariffs sort of changing that up a little bit? How do you see the bilateral economic relationship between the two countries developing over this next maybe year and a half?
Well, overall, I think the U.S.-Japan bilateral economic relationship is doing pretty well. As Prime Minister Ishida mentioned on February 7th, Japan has been the largest investor in the United States, and so that I think it's appreciated in the United States. With the exception of the Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel case, which we could talk about, but it would take a couple of hours. With that exception, I don't think there are, major economic areas of conflict between the U.S. and Japan. The concern, I think, more right now is on the military security side. Although I will say that because President Trump, for at least 40 years, had this obsession about bilateral trade imbalances, and now wanting to have Japan import LNG from Alaska to kind of lessen the bilateral trade imbalance. I mean, his views, based on all these speeches and interviews he had from the 80s, is, he's been critical of Japan on 5 issues. Number one, bilateral trade imbalance. Number two, his view that Japan exports tremendous amounts of products to the United States, but doesn't import from the United States. And thirdly, that Japan manipulates its currency, keeps it low so they can export. And number 5, Japan has a free rider on defense. So these are kind of latent underlying views that he seems to have. And so I think on issues like tariffs and autos in particular, and steel, I think those are areas where the Trump administration may decide that they need to do something with Japan. Okay. So it's not, at this point, on the radar screen as a high priority item, and I think initially at least there would be more focus on the military security side, but on the economic side, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that the Trump administration would decide to focus on that. Although for the time being, they seem to be preoccupied with Canada and Mexico and Greenland and Panama Canal and the EU and other things. So.
There's lots of issues certainly
Right.
today. So I'm going to ask for Mark's help to facilitate some questions from the audience. We'd love to hear from you. We would just ask that you keep your questions sort of relatively short and to the point, because we want to give people ample opportunity to be able to ask.
Well, I was a teaching fellow for Edwin Reischauer, and I guess with him, it was, I think, Government 118, post-war Japanese politics. And I guess with him, it was kind of a sense of balance that he seemed to have. As you know, rumor has it that it was his article in Foreign Affairs that caught the attention of Kennedy and his advisors. And the article that he wrote in Foreign Affairs, which apparently led to him becoming ambassador, was our broken dialogue with Japan. And it was right after the 1960 Security Treaty riots in June. And the argument of that article that Reischauer made as a professor at Harvard was that, as I mentioned to Shannon, that it's important for the U.S. ambassador, the U.S. government, to deal more widely with the opposition as well as the ruling party in Japan. And so I think the fact that he, having been born and raised in Japan, speaking Japanese, having studied at Oberlin and then at Harvard and also in Paris, and being knowledgeable about the history of Japan and China, that gave him a perspective that it's important to understand the country as opposed to just the leaders of the country. And so that's, I guess, one lesson I've taken away from Edwin Reischauer. Now, Ezra Vogel is much more complicated because in addition to being his teaching fellow for Sociology 114, when he visited Japan, at least once a year, and I was living in Japan, I would host him for various breakfast meetings and lunch meetings with Japanese scholars, Japanese journalists, Japanese former diplomats who spent time at Harvard, Japanese politicians. Many Japanese politicians had studied at the Kennedy School, and Japanese business leaders. So there were 5 groups. Oh, and also the Five Eyes ambassadors in Japan. So there were like 5 or 6 groups that I would get together with Ezra. And the thing about Ezra was that he was so open and kind and generous and supportive of even undergraduate students. And although, people said that although he was this world-famous scholar, he would always stay at the International House of Japan in Roppongi, rather than at the Imperial or one of these, really fancy hotels, expensive hotels, because because he was so well known for Japan as #1 and for Deng Xiaoping, he could have access to any Japanese political leader or business leader he wanted to have access to, but he also really valued the opportunity to interact with scholars and journalists and people. Again, he was from Ohio, and his son, Steve Vogel, who teaches at Berkeley, said his father brought kind of a working class Ohio way of operating at Harvard. And so, unlike a lot of Harvard professors who are very kind of aloof and self-important and so forth, Ezra was always open and always very generous. And I wrote a couple of obituaries or tributes to him. And when the New York Times called to get information for an obituary, I think all the people who knew Ezra, and a book, has come out from Harvard University Press with probably about 80 or so of his friends and colleagues and students. But one of the common themes is they talk about how open and friendly and humble he was, and always willing to learn, and also how much he valued human relationships. And he felt, that whether it was in Japan or South Korea or Taiwan or China, that he really had the ability to keep in touch with all kinds of people and all sorts of levels of society. So, I mean, he was a real sociologist, right? And so I really learned a lot from Ezra in that regard. And so, so those two professors, I really felt I was privileged to be a teaching fellow for. But the other professor, also David Reisman, who the author of The Lonely Crowd, Soxai 136, Character and Social Structure in America, it was his last year of teaching in 1976 when I was a teaching fellow for him. But it's interesting, although he was an American society specialist, he actually spent about 6 months in Japan in the early 60s at the invitation of the International House of Japan and wrote a book called Conversations in Japan, which is a very insightful book about Japan, despite the fact that he was only there 6 months and didn't speak Japanese. But so these three professors really had a profound impact on me, not only for their scholarship, but also the way they did their work. So thank you for asking the question.
And I'm going to say, hosting for the past 2 days, that it's very clear that you either had or learned those lessons from Ezra Vogel, because you're demonstrating those same characteristics in your stay here, and we really tremendously appreciate it. I see a hand in the back. Let me go that way.
India is playing an increasingly important role for the United States, partly because of its growing economy, growing population, growing market. Even as far back as 2000 to 2004, when I was the president in Japan for Cadence Design Systems, a Silicon Valley software company, I would go to Silicon Valley once a month from Japan, and the immigrants from India and also Indian Americans were playing a very important role, especially in the technology sector at that time. But increasingly since then, in the financial sector, in the academic sector, in the medical sector, in the political sector, clearly Indian Americans are playing a very important role in the United States. But at the same time, India's role and India's importance in the United States has really grown. Partly it's India itself, and I think partly it's China. Partly that I think both the United States and Japan, Mr. Abe in particular, thought of India as a country to kind of cultivate and to become closer to, in part as a strategy to try to deal with China. So dealing with India is very complicated because India itself, is a lot of political divisions within India. And with recent news in Canada and the United States about Indian government-related activity in the United States and Canada related to what the Indian government considers to be dissidents, that has certainly complicated the situation, especially between Canada and India. But I think my experience being in Washington for the last 13 years and also dealing a lot with Silicon Valley is that there's no question that India's importance to the United States will continue to increase economically, politically, militarily, and also so India itself, as well as Indian Americans and their role in American society. I mean, when I look in Washington, D.C., it's really quite evident, whether it's in politics in particular, where Indian Americans are increasingly active. But India is a very complicated place, and so I'm sure there are going to be ups and downs, and there are going to be some. I mean, the Indian Americans in the U.S. also are not necessarily unified as well, and so, but I think there's no question that economically, politically, and militarily, India will be increasingly important to the United States. It so happens that some friends of mine, Rich Verma and Ken Juster, have been ambassadors to India. And so I've heard from them also about the really increasing consciousness in the U.S. policymaking community, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, about the importance of India. And so I anticipate that's going to grow. One of the complications, obviously, India has close ties to Russia, and India wants to maintain its independence. And although they are part of the Quad, they certainly don't see themselves to be kind of the military security partner of the United States, as some people in the United States would like India to be. So, so I think, the U.S. Will be seeing India increasingly as a important country to deal with. So the February 7th summit meeting between Prime Minister Ishiba and President Trump was watched very closely, especially in Japan, because I think the view in Japan was that in 2016, the Japanese Foreign Ministry had pretty much advised Prime Minister Abe at the time that Hillary Clinton was likely to win the election, as many other people thought. And so I think Prime Minister Abe was not happy to see that the result was opposite of what had been predicted. And in part because in September of 2016, when Prime Minister Abe visited visited New York for the United Nations General Assembly meeting, some people in the Hillary Clinton team asked to have a meeting between candidate Clinton and Prime Minister Abe. And the Japanese government initially was hesitant because they felt it would not be good to meet with only one candidate, the Democratic candidate and not the Republican candidate. But apparently the view was, well, she's going to win anyway, so let's go ahead. so the meeting took place. I wasn't there, but I was asked by John Podesta, who was in the meeting, campaign chairman. He asked me if I would write a memo for candidate Clinton for that meeting. So I wrote a 3-page memo, and apparently she read it. And I got to read out later. And apparently the meeting went well. But because that meeting had taken place, I think the Japanese government felt that they really need to make an effort to kind of balance that by having an early meeting with President-elect Trump. So Prime Minister Abe was going to Lima, Peru for an APEC meeting. And so they quickly arranged for a meeting in Trump Tower on the 17th of November. And that meeting was really an incredibly interesting meeting because on the US side, you had President-elect Trump, you had Jared Kushner, had Ivanka Trump, and Michael Flynn, who was going to be National Security Advisor for 2 weeks. But he had no interpreter, had no note taker. On the Japanese side was Prime Minister Abe and Mr. Takao, his interpreter, foreign ministry official, a professional. Tokyo University, Kennedy School of Government, very bright, capable guy. Grew up partly in Chicago, completely bilingual. So the only minutes of that meeting are in the Japanese Foreign Ministry archives because there's no note taker on the US side. But for that meeting, Prime Minister Abe really prepared well. And I think Mr. Ishiba also really prepared well. And 3 things have become public. I think 2 other things have not become public, but I'm sure they will be at some point. But in that meeting on November 17th, Prime Minister Abe met with a number of Japanese who knew Trump when he was a businessman in the 1980s in New York. And so heard from them, heard from psychiatrists who analyzed Trump. And so there were 3 things that Prime Minister Abe did which really, really apparently was appreciated by the President-elect Trump. So Abe had done, his staff had done research. They knew that he loves golf. He has an obsession with gold. And so he took a $3,000 gold-plated golf club to give as a present. And because it was before he became president, he could accept the gift, right? And so that was one major thing. The second thing was there were some junior foreign ministry officials who advised the prime minister to show apparently a TikTok video of Arabella, the 6-year-old then granddaughter of Donald Trump, singing and dancing this Japanese song, Pineapple, Apple, something, this song. And so apparently showed it to him and said, your granddaughter, wonderful Japanese. So it really warmed the grandfather's heart. And then Abe said, I understand that you've had the New York Times as your enemy. I've had the Asahi Shimbun as my enemy. I've managed to crush the Asahi Shimbun. I hope you'll crush the New York Times. And Trump said, well, this is my type of guy. You know? And so then there were two other things that happened, which I won't get into here, but those 5 things apparently really did make Trump feel good. And so just before the official first summit meeting in February in Washington and also in Mar-a-Lago, Trump was shown on TV saying, yeah, Shinzo and I, we've got great chemistry. So the Japanese have learned from that. And so in preparation for Prime Minister Ishiba's visit to Washington, they really coached him. They went through a lot of simulations as to what kind of questions are going to come up, you know. But the secret weapon that Japan has is the interpreter, Mr. Takao, who, although his level now is way beyond that of an interpreter, they decided to bring him back to be the interpreter because Trump likes him. Trump calls him little prime minister. He feels very assured when Mr. Takao is there. So Mr. Takao was the interpreter for Mr. Ishiba, and not only, I think, interpreted for him, but coached him and guided him and made sure that he said things in a way that the president would understand and appreciate. And so overall, I think the results of that meeting were quite good. And I think I'd heard from the Japanese side that the Japanese side really, really prepared. And on the U.S. side, really wasn't all that prepared yet, in part because many of the positions were not yet filled on the U.S. side. But I mean, I think the State Department professionals and NSC staff people, I mean, they really did prepare. And I think they coordinated well with the Japanese side. So the joint statement that came out and so forth was fine. There were some interesting aspects about the press conference because let's see, there were like several things in that press conference that were interesting. Actually, there were some mistranslations, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So one of the journalists asked Prime Minister Ishiba, so this is the first time that you met the president. You know, what was your impression? So Ishiba said something like, well, I had seen President Trump on video, and on video he seems like a rather difficult, tough person, but in person he's actually quite a nice person. And he said something like, you know, and I don't mean to you know, be overly praising or something like that. I think he said something like, お世辞を言うつもりではありませんが, or something like that. The interpreter interpreted, I don't mean to suck up to the president. Now, this was not the official interpreter. You see, it was I think there were 2 women who were commercial interpreters who were for the press conference as opposed to the private meeting. So, I mean, suck up is not exactly the word one would use, but probably Trump liked it, right? And so then another question towards the end was one of the journalists asked, Mr. Prime Minister, Canada and the EU are preparing to retaliate against the United States if the U.S. imposes tariffs. What will Japan do if Japan imposes tariffs on Japan, or U.S. imposes tariffs on Japan? And Ishiba said something like, I don't answer hypothetical questions is what I would usually answer in a diet interpolation. So he meant this to be kind of a joke, but the interpreter, for some reason, omitted the last part. So she just said, I don't answer hypothetical questions. But then Trump said, oh, that's a great answer. That's a great answer. He knows what he's doing. So I guess the translation was wrong, but apparently the result was okay. But the main point is that I think the Japanese side really did prepare for that meeting, and and the interpreter was, and this interpreter, I mean, he is the person in Japan who knows more about Trump than anybody. And while he was in China, he was assigned at the embassy in Beijing. He read every book he could find on Trump, and he was basically advising to his bosses in the foreign ministry which were the best books to read about Trump. And so, so I think it shows, I think both the November 17th meeting and the February 7th meeting shows that preparations are important, and the Japanese side really prepared, and I think they reap the benefits of the preparation.
I'll just say once again, on behalf of everybody here, just really thank you so much. I think we all will walk away from this event this afternoon understanding a little bit more about the importance of the relationship between the two countries. So really, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Shannon. I really appreciate the opportunity that Mark's provided for me to share views, and also appreciate your questions, and wish you the best of luck in Vietnam in your next assignment.
Thank you. Thank you.